If I may have your attention, I think we'll get started. It's a tradition at the New America Foundation to get started on time and end on time and run all our panels on time. So we hope to hold to that tradition today. I'm Cheryl Sweniger, Director of the Economic Growth Program at the New America Foundation, and on behalf of my colleagues, I want to welcome you today and also welcome those of you who may eventually watch this event by web feed, etc. The purpose of the event today is to share some rethinking that we've been doing in the next social contract initiative at the New America Foundation, rethinking about some of the essential features of our social contract and social economic policy, and rethinking about some of the reforms that are needed to have a healthy economy and society going forward. Essentially, we've been working with, I think, three working hypotheses, and I just wanted to briefly mention them as a prelude to the preface to the panel discussions you'll hear today. The first was that the social contract was deeply implicated in the crisis that led to the Great Recession. This was not just a financial crisis, but it was a crisis of a model of political economy that had allowed wages nearly year after year to fall behind or lag behind productivity growth, that had permitted inequality, both wealth and income inequality, to reach 1920s levels, and that attempted to paper over these deep imbalances in our domestic and global society with easy credit and rising home and asset prices for a while. Secondly, this Great Recession has been so devastating and has had such a profound effect on the future of American society and the economy because it struck at two of the core features, or at the very heart of our social contract, namely employment, access to jobs and employment, and home ownership. And more importantly, it struck at two of the main bipartisan accomplishments or successes, or what were considered successes of the last two presidencies. In the Clinton years, of course, the Clinton years, in essence, led to so-called reforms that made our social welfare system actually more tied to employment, more tied to having a job, and made the delivery of our social benefit system more tied to income and the income tax system. Thus, when we have high levels of unemployment, suddenly we have a crisis in our social welfare system and in the delivery of social benefits as well. In the combined Clinton and Bush years, of course, it was the championing of the ownership society, the extension and expansion of home ownership, and the shift from a defined benefit world of retirement savings to 401ks that pushed the responsibility onto individuals and away from companies. The third sort of working hypothesis that we've been unfortunately forced to come to is that the policies and programs, in spite of the healthcare reform bill, in spite of the financial regulation reform, that the policies and programs that the Obama administration and Congress have been, in essence, forced to adopt represent more a continuation of the pre-Great Recession social contract than they do a major new reform direction. If anything, the recovery so far has hit the resume button, that the trends in that it is revisiting in some ways the trends that led us to the crisis in the first place. And obviously that's most evident in the fact that, again, we have record bonuses and surging profits on Wall Street, and wage stagnation, unemployment, and foreclosures in Main Streets. Unfortunately, the election looks like is going to further complicate and compound the lessons from the Great Recession. Right now, American politics has seemingly two gears as its options: resume and reverse, when in fact we need three other gears in the process, and that is recovery, reform, and restructuring. This exercise today, in which we're inviting a number of other experts in the Washington, D.C. and the national policy scene to join with us today, is really an exercise of exploring what a real recovery, reform, and restructuring agenda that takes us in a different direction would look like, and what the politics of that would entail. Just a few further words. I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge, in case I don't have time later, the financial support that we've received for this work from Bernard Swartz and from the Rockefeller Foundation, and also acknowledge the important contributions my colleagues have made to this event and this work. Michael Lynn, Policy Director of the Economic Growth Program; Reed Kramer, Director of the Assets Program; Lauren Dami, who bears a lot of the credit for putting this event together; Sam Sheridan, Justin King from the Assets Program, and Shane Henry and Sam Sheridan. So without further ado, it's about 9:10, and we'll get started with the first panel. Just another further word about procedure. We run these in a seamless fashion, meaning there are no breaks between the panels. So as one panel ends, another will reassemble. However, you're always free to get up and take advantage of the buffet in the back or otherwise. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Michael Lind. I'm the Policy Director of the Economic Growth Program at the New America Foundation. Perhaps the central crisis of the many crises associated with the Great Recession is joblessness, the mass unemployment, which, as Cheryl pointed out, is affecting every aspect of the safety net, in addition to the agony it inflicts on individuals directly. To explore the need for new approaches to full employment this morning, we have three of the country's leading experts on the topic. Heidi Sherholz, economist, labor market economist with the Economic Policy Institute; James Galbraith, who is the Lloyd M. Benson Jr. Chair in Government Business Relations at the University of Texas at Austin; and Cheryl Schwinninger, Director of the Economic Growth Program at the New America Foundation. You can find their more elaborate biographies in the packet of materials that you picked up on the way in here. But in the interest of time, we will begin with Heidi Sherholz.
Good morning, and thank you. I was asked to speak about how employment has changed in the Great Recession, or as a result of the Great Recession. In the end, this turns out to be a pretty straightforward story. The necessary background is this, and it will sound pretty familiar: the bursting of an $8 trillion housing bubble and the resulting loss of wealth led to sharp cutbacks in consumer spending. The loss of consumers, combined with financial market chaos triggered by the bubble's burst, led to a collapse in business investment. As consumer spending and business investment dried up, massive job loss followed. In 2008 and 2009, we lost 8.4 million jobs. Further, even after economic output stopped contracting in the summer of 2009, its growth since then has not been nearly fast enough to generate the jobs needed even to keep pace with regular growth in the population, much less to put the backlog of workers who lost their jobs during the collapse back to work. So that's the background. Where are we now? This plot shows payroll employment over the 2000s. We are currently 7.8 million jobs below where we were when the recession started in December 2007. But importantly, because the population is growing all the time, we actually have to add around 100,000 jobs every month just to tread water, just to keep the unemployment rate from rising. So over the 33 months since the recession started, we should have added 3.4 million jobs. So the gap in the labor market right now is over 11 million jobs. This, in a nutshell, is how employment has changed in the Great Recession. There was a massive drop in demand, and we are down over 11 million jobs. So this means that once a worker gets laid off from a job, the odds are stacked very strongly against them finding another one anytime soon. So this shows the number of job seekers per job opening. In August, the latest data available, it was 4.6 to 1. So it's important to note that that is not the number of applicants for each job opening. I actually don't have a measure of the number of applicants per job opening, but I'm sure it would be much, much higher than 4.6 to 1 because unemployed workers apply for many jobs. This literally means that for every 4.6 unemployed workers, there is only one job available. As you can see, that is a big improvement from where we were a year ago. It's come way down, but it is still far higher than the worst month of the early 2000s recession, and it's about 3 times as high as it was before the Great Recession started. Okay, so while this slide and the previous one document that on aggregate we have a huge jobs deficit right now, could it also be true that employment has changed more fundamentally than simply a demand-related loss of jobs? That there may be profound structural changes that these aggregate numbers are masking? We know that there are always some structural changes going on in any economy, but is there evidence that that's a predominant story right now? And that a key aspect of today's unemployment is that many firms have job openings but can't find appropriate workers. Before I take that question to the data, I think it's important to note that we'd want to know if unemployment right now is predominantly structural, because the policy responses would be very different if unemployment is structural versus if it is predominantly because of a lack of demand. If it is predominantly because of a lack of demand, then we want to do additional stimulus and monetary policy to bolster demand. But if unemployment is predominantly structural, that would be foolish. That wouldn't work. And instead, the appropriate policy response would be education and training to the unemployed to help them make job transition. So knowing the right answer to this question actually has profound policy implications. All right, now the underlying data. This shows, so this last slide shows the number of job openings, unemployed workers per job opening. This slide breaks it out, so you see both unemployed workers in light blue and job openings in red, and it does it by sector. If unemployment right now is in large part structural, then we would expect to see some sectors where there are more unemployed workers than job openings. And here's a key, we would also expect to see some sectors where there are more job openings than unemployed workers, or at least where it is much more balanced. In other words, for structural unemployment to be a major part of overall unemployment, you would expect to see labor shortages in some areas, as employers with job openings couldn't find suitable workers. But as the figure shows, there are no major sectors where this is happening. Unemployed workers dramatically outnumber job openings in every single sector. So these data certainly suggest that by far the main story here isn't that the economy is lacking the right workers, but instead, across the board, it's lacking jobs. Okay, but let's look at this another way. Oops, I think I went too far. Let's look at this another way. As I said, we were brought into the Great Recession by the bursting of an $8 trillion housing bubble that had, of course, a lot of construction work associated with it. And this is interesting. About a quarter of all jobs lost in this recession were construction jobs. So while there's a lack of job openings across the board, one thing you can see here is that unemployed workers relative to job openings is much higher in construction than in any other of those sectors. So could it be that construction is driving unemployment? So this guy shows unemployment shares by industry. So by industry, the share of the unemployed that fall into each of those industries, both in 2007, which is the dark blue, and in 2010, which is the light blue. I didn't put the numbers on here, I should have, but I'll tell you the key ones. In 2007, before the recession started, construction made up 10.7% of the unemployed. Now, makes up 12.5%. It's an increase, but it's less than 2 percentage points. Also, we should keep in mind that, like manufacturing, construction is always a very cyclical industry, so its unemployment share always goes up in recessions. But to illustrate a point, let's take a very unrealistic example and assume that the construction share of the unemployed didn't rise at all during the Great Recession. Holding everything else constant, if the the construction share of unemployment was still 10.7%, and those construction workers that made up the remainder were employed instead of unemployed, there would be 300,000 fewer unemployed construction workers today. If there were 300,000 fewer unemployed workers today, the unemployment rate, instead of 9.6%, would be 9.4%. So even in this very unrealistic example, construction is clearly not driving things. And if you look at this, neither is unemployment in manufacturing. Looking across sectors, there aren't any where the share of unemployed in that sector is dramatically higher now than it was before the recession started. In other words, the unemployed are spread out across sectors in similar proportions to how they were before the recession started. There are just, across the board, more of them. One thing that I just want to note is that many would argue that structural unemployment happens by occupation, not industry. Since the same occupation can exist in many industries, if you have a worker shortage in a given occupation that cuts across industries, if you look by industry, you're not going to see it. I did not bring these numbers by occupation, but they exist by occupation. I've looked at them, and the same story comes through, which is there's just not much there. The occupation shares of unemployment are pretty darn similar in 2007 as they are in 2010. So, wait, no, I just will finish on this. So neither with job openings by industry, nor with unemployment by industry or occupation do we find evidence that the main problem is anything other than a broad-based lack of demand for workers. In other words, while in an economy this big, there will always be firms in some places who can't find the workers they need. Right now, by far the predominant story is in the exact opposite direction, that workers can't find jobs because the jobs aren't there. There is simply no systematic empirical evidence otherwise. So given that, the policy conclusions are pretty straightforward. First, more education and training to help workers make job transitions will help some individuals, but it's not going to solve the employment crisis, since there is a lack of jobs across the board. In other words, you can't train your way out of a demand problem. To solve this problem, we need to be at full throttle with mechanisms that will stimulate demand. This includes actions by the Fed, including using available mechanisms to reduce long-term interest rates and raise inflation targets, and importantly, substantial additional fiscal stimulus, including aid to the long-term unemployed, fiscal relief to states, and more infrastructure spending. And with that, I'll turn it over to, thank you.
Dr. Goldberg?
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here, and I want to congratulate the organizers of this symposium for entitling it The Need to Revise Policy Assumptions. One of my father's better lines was that when confronted with the choice between revising their core assumptions and proving that there's no need to do so, most people just get out their pencils and get busy with the proof. Despite the letter of the law, the Humphrey-Hawkins Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act of 1978, which, as it happened, I helped to draft, America actually has never had a social contract that effectively provided for full employment, nor any powerful institutions that were truly dedicated to this objective. We have enjoyed 3 periods of full employment in modern history: 1942 to 1946 in World War II under price control, 1966 to 1969 under the impetus of full employment Keynesianism with some help from the Vietnam War, in a period when the labor force was older, substantially more male and whiter than it is at present. And then in the late 1990s, roughly 1998 to 2000, in the information technology boom. These episodes did prove that full employment is possible. And the third one established that peacetime full employment is non-inflationary, even when we are working at much higher labor force participation rates than had been true historically. The resulting trade deficit was very large, but it was not the constraint that brought that episode to an end. The decade after the information technology boom was devoted, I think it's fair to say, to patchwork efforts to keep the economy growing without reconsidering the underlying institutional framework. There were a number of measures that went toward this objective, the Bush tax cuts, for example, being the first. I think you can count the Iraq War in part as having had some effect to grow the economy for a very brief period of time. When that didn't prove to be sufficient, there was a public spending boom in 2004. The president declined to veto any appropriations bill. But the most important factor, as we all know, was the subprime credit boom and the housing bubble, something which expanded investment and provided employment up until the crash in 2007. The effect of the inevitable fall of the subprime bubble was to destroy both the credit-giving institutions of our economy and the middle-class financial wealth of American households, as well as the 8 million jobs of which we have just heard. And we are now, as you also have just heard, 11 million short of where we need to be. I think we need to bear that institutional fact in mind, and I'll come back to it. When the crisis happened, the Federal Reserve and later the incoming Obama administration believed that the engine was simply stalled, that you could fuel it up and restart it and it would go again. And on top of the TARP and the Bush years, quantitative easing, QE, and the stimulus package were thought to be sufficient. In fact, and to switch metaphors, the reactor had melted down. And when you've had a meltdown, you can't simply throw a switch and get the thing moving again. The failure to understand this fact, I think, is the key analytical failure of this White House and this Treasury Department and this Federal Reserve. It also lies behind the most important policy assumptions that still underlie budget projections by the Congressional Budget Office, and explains why they too will consistently prove both over-optimistic in the short run and misdirected in the long run. But it has been very hard to get this point across. And as it has been said, it is very hard to get a man to understand something when his livelihood depends on not understanding it. There are 2 narratives going forward. Inside what you might call the Beltway bubble, The talk is of budget deficits, of public debt, of unsustainable entitlement programs, of the need for austerity. One might say a concerted effort to draw attention away from the financial failure and to advance a long-standing agenda of public spending cuts, Social Security and Medicare cuts, and ultimately privatization. This is an agenda which is entirely based upon pre-crisis assumptions and has not been adjusted in any material way to the collapse that we have been suffering through. Logical consistency is therefore not a strong suit of the advocates in this group. They cannot explain why the Bush tax cuts or the military should be exempt from the austerity they are urging for everything else. They cannot explain why we should worry about crowding out of private investment when there isn't any, nor why we should worry about high interest rates at a moment when there is obviously enormous excess demand for government bonds, and the long-term yields on those bonds are at historical lows and falling every week. They cannot explain, most importantly, where the new jobs will come from, where those 11 million jobs will come from if we cut back on the jobs that are presently supported by public expenditure. In the larger world, you don't hear this narrative, unless you turn on your television, in which case it comes at you. In the larger world, the concerns and the focus are on jobs, on unemployment insurance, on credit, and now, especially on the epidemic, the emerging epidemic of foreclosure fraud. People understand that jobs are tied to credit and credit to properly functioning banks. And here I want to suggest that the discussion of structural unemployment here is, while it's the conventional one for labor market economists, it misstates the structural problem. We do, in fact, have a structural problem. It is the failure of institutions which we have used for decades to provide the fuel for economic expansion. And that's a problem which has to be dealt with by structural measures. The foreclosure fraud crisis reminds us yet again that what we lack is an effectively functioning financial sector working for public purpose. People understand that we need this. They are suspicious of government-only solutions, that is to say, stimulus packages, because their experience is that jobs largely come from markets. Markets are largely funded by banks and other credit institutions, and these operate in our economy on a scale much larger than government does. So whatever government does, it's simply hard for people to see it operating on a scale sufficient to replace what we ordinarily expect banks to be doing. And one might add that credit and job creation are the only routes to deficit reduction. So if you're concerned about that problem, you have to have a functioning, well-funded private sector that is paying taxes. It's the only way to resolve it. How to get there? The first thing that we need to do, top of the agenda, is to restructure the banking sector. It is simply not going to be possible to have strong economic growth with a banking sector in which a half a dozen institutions dominate the market and are not interested in making commercial and industrial loans or otherwise serving the purposes of a long-term growing economy. If we can't see that that is the problem we face, then we're not going to get very far. Secondly, to a certain degree, we can and should bypass the banking sector by creating new funds that will support activity on different criteria. That is to say, a national infrastructure fund, new facilities for small business lending, whatever it takes to provide the financing and the monitoring of the activity that we need to have in our economy. And thirdly, we need to deal with the problem of a formerly middle class, now deeply indebted and hopelessly underwater on their mortgages, with the price of their one major asset, their house, continuing to decline. Many of these people will end up in default. That will free up their incomes so they will start spending them on goods and services, which is in fact a good thing. But we need to work out how to resolve this process, because the longer it goes on, the longer we're simply stuck in a limbo where this entire sector is not contributing anything to economic recovery. What is the role of the federal government? It is substantial, but we have to recognize, it seems to me, that the federal government operates now at the wholesale level. It's a relatively small institutional enterprise, and we are not going to go back to the New Deal with the Works Progress Administration, the Public Works Administration, Civilian Conservation Corps under the Army, providing millions of jobs to young men largely fresh off the farm. It's not going to happen. What we need to do is to think about how the federal government can help restructure the economy so as to get over this enormous labor market hurdle. One way is to support states and localities so that they are not cutting back while we're trying to expand. I have long advocated the restoration of Richard Nixon's General Revenue Sharing Program for this purpose, unfortunately terminated by the man after whom this building is named, Ronald Reagan. But if you can't do that, then federalizing Medicaid would be an effective, functional way to put cash in the hands of state and local governments and enable them to maintain the local public services that both provide employment and which are greatly valued by the population. We have taken steps to relieve the burden of the payroll tax on working families. We could expand those steps. And the more money you put in the hands of working people, the more relief you give them on their mortgages, their car payments. We could expand the concept of revenue sharing to cover major nonprofits in higher education, which has the effect of providing employment. There's a massive amount of employment in this country which is provided in the nonprofit sector, about 8% of the total. That is under stress, and in the case of higher education, it also holds younger people off the labor force, so it reduces unemployment from that point of view as well. Perhaps most dramatically, the assumption that we need to rethink at the moment concerns how we treat older people. We are operating, and have been operating in our discourse, on the idea that somehow people should be working longer because on average they're living longer. Well, richer people are anyway. That we have financing problems in Social Security and Medicare, which is a myth, especially with respect to Social Security. When you think about this from an economic point of view, you've got to recognize that there is no way, practically, we are going to find 11 million jobs in any short period of time. And what that means is that younger people coming onto the job market who are freshly educated, who want to form families and households, are going to be waiting for a long time, much longer than they should, before they get that first job, before they get that first stable job, because older people are hanging on to employment, and because other older people, people throughout the age structure, are looking for work that they can't find and competing with them for every available slot. Well, the right way to deal with this problem is to provide a reasonable opportunity for people who would like to get out of the labor force to do so. And that's why I've suggested that we explore ways to make it attractive for people who have had hard working lives and who would like to afford to retire early to do so. One suggestion I made is let's take that 62 and make it a full benefit retirement age for 3 years, so that people who want to get out but are hanging on for the full Social Security benefit can get it early. Right? Just move them out of the labor force if they want to go. I've suggested cutting the age of eligibility for Medicare to 55 so that people who are hanging on to their jobs for medical reasons because they can't afford to give up their insurance can get out if they want to. I don't know exactly what volumes you need or how this would work, but the idea here, which needs to be thought through very carefully, is that we should revise our assumptions about retirement. We need to have our retired population contributing to demand through the fact that they have stable income, expenditure patterns, and access to health care, contributing to demand in a stable and predictable way, and not competing for jobs that they don't want nearly as much as other people do. And the federal government has the power to make institutional changes that can help us restructure our economy and return to a reasonable balance between the employment that we need and the employment that we provide. Thank you very much.
to Dr. Schwinninger.
Thank you, Mike, and my great appreciation both Jamie and Heidi. I think they picked up well on the themes that I outlined in my opening remarks of the need to think about recovery, restructuring, and reform, as well as just hitting the reset, resume button. The first thing I want to do is to remind us why full employment is important. And while, as Jamie says, we have only had 3 sort of historical periods where we've actually probably achieved full employment, nonetheless, the pursuit of it is an important, larger societal and economic goal for a number of reasons, because it is one of the few things that allows a tight labor market, allows a better bargaining position for workers and a better distribution of the gains of productivity, and often leads to further productivity gains as companies in an attempt to offset the need for workers make technological advances in capital investment. So in some ways, full employment is an engine of innovation, if you will. It's also particularly a non-inflationary period where we're in now of overcapacity. It is the best way, as Jamie pointed out, to increase government revenues and to deal with any concerns about a overly large deficit. So full employment must remain an essential goal, in addition for the reasons that I outlined earlier, namely so much of our social welfare system and the delivery of our social benefits are tied up with employment. Now, we may need to change that in reforms, but until then, we do have to find ways to get us closer back to full employment. Now, our estimate is that by 2016, we'll need to create more than 19 million jobs. This is the 11 to 12 million jobs deficit that Heidi outlined that we currently have, plus approximately 1.6 million additional jobs that we'll have to create each year for the next 5 years because of the growth of the labor force. So whether it's 18, 19, or 20, we're in the ballpark that it's a very, very large number, and at the pace we're going, we're not going to get there. In fact, both unemployment and underemployment looks like to remain high for many, many years. And part of the reason I argue is that, as Jamie says, we haven't come to grips with the nature of the economy and the meltdown of the economy that was created by the bursting of the housing and credit bubbles. Now, to some degree, we got the policy that the politics would give us in some ways. But here in this chart, I indicate there's a certain logic to the things we did and the kind of jobless and unsustainable recovery, lopsided recovery we had. We had an overemphasis on monetary reflation. The one thing that the Fed does is that the Fed, not bound by necessarily by the same political constraints, has dramatically slashed interest rates, engaged in a variety of unconventional measures of QE1, and now about ready to embark on QE2 and probably 3. And that logically resulted in asset reflation and a stabilization of financial sector profits and the beginning of the return of some global trade imbalances as well. Now, we did have the stimulus program was heavy on tax cuts in spite of the Republicans not participating. Their mere presence had pushed a lot of the Recovery Act towards tax cuts. Also, obviously, it was quick and easy to get out the door. But tax cuts, cash for clunkers, unemployment insurance, some of it very necessary. In the end, it provided just temporary support for consumer spending, which we're now beginning to see the implications of the waning of that. And then by relative comparison, we had very modest infrastructure and public work spending, which I attribute to be an explanation for why we've had weak job creation and stagnant wages, because so relatively little money was put into that particular policy option. Now, why didn't policy deliver full employment? Well, it's again because, as Jamie said, they were working from the wrong assumptions. You know, if the one full employment policy that we have going for us now is, or new policy is the embarking on QE2, but even the theory by which the Fed is undertaking this policy has a very, very, very remote relationship from creating jobs. The theory is essentially that you put air under asset prices. And by putting air under asset prices, you make certain groups of people feel wealthier than they might otherwise be. And when they feel slightly wealthier than they might be, they're a little bit more confident to spend and put more money in the economy, which may eventually lead to some improvement in demand and job creation. It's a very indirect route. The other part of QE2 reliance is that you so flatten the yield curve that banks eventually decide, well, that they actually might make some loans to working businesses, but again, it's a very remote relationship to full employment. So monetary policy can do very little and have little impact at this stage, in my view, on job creations. The other second pillar of the Recovery Act was to create general demand stimulation and support, which is the right general policy to do so. But unfortunately, the U.S. is a much more open economy now, and an economy where particularly companies and corporations are obsessed with cost-cutting and maintaining profit margins. So what happens, it's sort of like trying to fill up a bathtub. As one of my colleagues says, it's like trying to fill up a bathtub without putting in the stopper first, meaning that you flood the bathtub with a lot of water, but it only rises so far because a lot of it's leaking out. Part of it's leaking out to stimulate demand in the world economy for economies that aren't reciprocating with equal fiscal stimulation. So it's an asymmetrical sort of demand creation. And secondly, you're creating demand which, given the overcapacity that most companies have, they can easily fill it without adding jobs. So general demand stimulation, while necessary, has certain shortcomings in the kind of economy we face. The third assumption that they didn't understand is that in some ways the private sector job machine has been broken for not just a year or two, but for a decade now. There were, in fact, very few net private sector jobs created since 2000, since the bursting of the tech bubble. Now part of that is good news in the sense there was productivity growth, and therefore firms and companies could expand their business without hiring a lot of new people. But this is part of a larger evolution that we failed to understand. As economies become more sophisticated and as the private sector becomes more productive, more of the jobs are actually going to be related in one way or another to the public sector or created by public sector demand for services. So we've expected this miracle of private sector job creation to come back, and it probably isn't going to come back at the same in the same levels, nor in some ways do we want it to, because we want our companies to be extremely productive. So but it does pose a policy challenge and dilemma. At the New America Foundation, to oversimplify, we essentially have put forward a three-point growth and jobs creation agenda, which borrows and reflects a lot of what Heidi and Jamie have already said. The first dimension of that, the first pillar, is substantial public and private investment in infrastructure. For essentially three reasons. One, public infrastructure, there's a huge deficit, and it will have immediate returns in terms of job creation and a multiplier effect. Each $1 billion of infrastructure spending, depending on a project, can create as many as 20 to 30,000 jobs, and it has both short-term and long-term benefits. Moreover, in keeping with Jamie's notion of how the federal government helps to restructure the economy, one can use financing facilities or a public infrastructure bank, a national infrastructure bank, or regional infrastructure banks to leverage large amounts of private capital, which are actually sitting idle today, earning less than 1% returns on two-year notes. Putting that money to work is both essential for the economic recovery, essential for our long-term productivity growth and productive economy, but quite a necessary element if we're going to close this 11 million jobs deficit. The second dimension is expansion of public services, either done directly by creating public sector employment for education, healthcare, old age care, daycare, or done indirectly by a proposal my colleagues Mike Lind and Lauren Dame have suggested through some sort of voucher program that will expand formal employment in providing old age care and other necessary public services. This is essential for moving towards something approaching full employment. And finally, a pro-growth industrial policy. The fact is that while the demand side is absolutely critical, we can't entirely ignore the supply side going forward, especially in a critical international policy environment, and doing things that put in place, making the United States a more attractive place to create jobs, to do investment, and et cetera, is an important dimension of a longer-term jobs program. And that could include also measures that Leo Hendry had proposed, such as Buy America provisions that optimize the use of government procurement money. It means putting in essential infrastructure to crowd in investment that wouldn't otherwise occur. It means extended job apprentice programs to get young people in the technical jobs that will provide a reasonable middle class standard of living. So with that broad outline of our growth and jobs agenda, I'll turn it back over to the moderator.
Thank you. We have about 10 minutes for questions, so please, when you ask a question and you've been called on, wait until someone arrives with a mic. And also, please identify yourself. Questions?
Sam.
Sam, right here.
Hi, my name is Shannon. I work for LaRouche PAC. And my question's for Mr. Galbraith. You said with some conviction that we will not return to the New Deal policies, the CCC, WPA, and all of these programs that were really successful. My question is your reasoning for saying that because Obama's in office? Because if that's the case, I completely agree. And so I was wondering if you would consider instead calling for Obama's removal from office, as LaRouche has called for with the 25th Amendment.
Well, my Canadian grandfather was once quoted as saying that his one regret in life was that he'd never had the opportunity to vote for Franklin Roosevelt. You know, I feel the same way. I'm sure many of us in this hall do too. But no, the answer is I don't think it's because Obama's in office. It's because we live in the 21st century and the conditions have changed.
Other questions?
My question is mainly for Ms. Shields. I'm Amy Medeiros from the delegation of the European Union here in Washington. I agree that the problems with high unemployment are mainly cyclical in nature, but are you not sort of glossing over in the discussion some of the things that could become structural problems, or if we want to not call them or use structural unemployment, that term, you know, something structural in nature with the high rate of long-term unemployment? Are we not looking at you know, problems in the future that may mean that we are that full employment is a much higher unemployment rate than we might have thought before?
It's a good question, and I think, but the answer to that question leads to the exact same policy prescriptions, because the thing that you're talking about, I think, is, all right, so maybe we don't have massive structural employment, or we don't have predominant structural employment right now, but if we go, which we likely will for another several years of very high persistent unemployment, and we know we have record levels of long-term unemployment, this recession has broken every record related to duration of unemployment spells, is that going to create structural problems through this hysteresis effect? So what that leads to, there could be something there. What that leads to, though, is we need to stimulate demand to get jobs back. Like it all sort of gets to the same point of the one way to combat that is to start getting jobs back again. So it's a very interesting question and way of thinking about it with the exact same policy prescription.
Just very quickly, I think the historical experience is that when you have strong demand for labor, these skills problems disappear overnight. People are good for the jobs they're hired to do, and they learn very quickly.
Yeah, and I'll just say one final thing. You hear people, long-term unemployment, it leads to an erosion of skills and marketability. It's actually hard. You have to rack your brain to come up with an occupation where you're out of the labor force for 1 or even 2 years and the world passes you by. It's actually hard to come up with such a thing, and I think Jamie's point is right. The jobs come back, these people are largely going to be able to get work, but it's the jobs. That's what we need.
I'm Isaiah Poole from the Campaign for America's Future. Ms. Scheiholtz, you begin to touch on the consequences of what is projected to be at least 2 years of policy paralysis on Capitol Hill. But I wanted you and Mr. Galbraith and Mr. Lynn and Mr. Schweninger to sort of spell out the consequences that we might be facing of policy paralysis on Capitol Hill when it comes to jobs.
Sure. I can go ahead. Go ahead. Let me just quickly talk about what given what we forecasters think is going to happen policy-wise, then what the unemployment forecast is going forward. We have unemployment forecasted to be probably around 9.9% next year, which will actually be higher than the highest annual rate of the early 80s recession. Then somewhere in the 8s next year, it will be higher, in 2012, higher than the highest annual rate of the early 90s recession. In 2013, unemployment rate forecasted to be over 6%, 6 years, 2013, 6 years after the start of this recession, that's still a higher annual rate than the highest annual rate of the early 2000s recession. So we keep going on this path, and I can let others speak to the politics of it. We are going to have recessionary unemployment levels through 2013 and elevated beyond that. So that paralysis has real effects on the ground.
I guess I would make 3 points. For the last 6 to 9 months, we've seen a prelude of this paralysis, and that's why all eyes are currently on the Fed. With some delusion, I should say, because we have had a preview of what the paralysis looks like, meaning that not much is going to happen on the jobs front. The second point I would be making is if there are some Republican gains in the state governors' offices, then I think you're going to see a somewhat interesting dynamic where those state governors, while they may have been elected and or forced by their constitutions to cut and balance budget, nonetheless are going to be more supportive of federal support. They'll be playing a double game. They'll be talking about austerity and cuts at the state level, but quietly trying to get as many federal dollars as possible out of Washington. Christie, in some ways, Governor Christie is already playing this game to some degree. Other Republican governors will be. To my mind, that opens up possibly some space for some of the things that Jamie mentioned in terms of revenue sharing, federalizing Medicaid, etc. The third point I would make is that this is why it is so important. The odds are against us to actually make progress on something like a national infrastructure bank, which can leverage a little amount of federal money and put large amounts of private capital work on federal state job creation and infrastructure programs. If we don't find a way in some ways to circumvent the purely appropriations process in terms of being able to restructure the economy and promote recovery, then we will be in a very, very sad situation come 2012. And therefore, I think a lot of the emphasis and priority ought to be in making progress on something like an infrastructure bank or a series of infrastructure banks or a series of new credit institutions that expand the use of federal direction of private capital.
3 quick points. First, I have no confidence that anything the Federal Reserve will do will have any material effect on the job situation. They're basically engaged in asset swaps for the benefit of financial institutions. Secondly, the legislative paralysis may well coincide with the revival of the banking crisis and force the administration to pay attention to the problem of bank structure. And that is what is happening as the foreclosure fraud develops, as the pace of foreclosures slows down, as the pace of defaults and strategic defaults increases, and as investors become increasingly insistent on demanding that banks buy back defective mortgage securities that they sold to the world, defective and fraudulent mortgage securities, and thereby eventually recognize the losses that they incurred by issuing essentially counterfeit securities to the world market in the first place. Third, if there is a silver lining in all of this, it may be that we will get past the point of having our thinking dominated by short-term fixes and be able to develop a coherent strategic direction. We're going to enter a period of great policy incoherence, not necessarily without some useful things, and you just mentioned one with respect to aid to states and localities, but essentially great policy incoherence and ineffectiveness, and that gives us an opportunity to break with the very sterile and ineffective strategies which were common to the late Bush administration and the early Obama administration.
Thank you. It's 10:05. In order to keep close to our schedule, we'll be transitioning to the next panel. Please join me in thanking Heidi Sherholtz, James Galbraith, and Cheryl Schwinninger.